Hello, so welcome to the new Strongfit podcast episode. Today we're going to talk about, we did a podcast like 1, 2, and 3 on obesity and depression, and today is part 4. Don't get me wrong, even at part 22 we still wouldn't be halfway through the subject. There's a lot in the last podcast. I introduced a lot of ideas, but also new rabbit holes and everything. I just want to cover certain important parts straight up. And then from there, maybe later podcasts go deeper into specific rabbit holes. But I think there were major points that need to be understood when it comes to depression and things like this. So a major important one is inflammation. There's the podcast that I did on a paper that was called on affective immunology, that was linking the immune system and the emotional system, saying that it was basically the same system. They were essentially part of the same idea, the same system. It's an idea that goes very, very, very far. The podcast is on it. The paper is in the Strongfit vault. I suggest to read it, and then because as we cover the inflammatory response and how it is linked to depression, you're going to see that we're going back to that idea of immune system and emotional system being linked. So not a podcast you saw yet, but one you should. The paper is very interesting.
I'm very well prepared today.
Yeah, there you go.
I was not briefed beforehand, but that doesn't matter.
Well, even when you're brief, you seem not to want to follow up on it. That's a private joke. There's things in the background you don't know about. There you go. So the paper is depression is an inflammatory disease, but where does the inflammation come from? We know now that depression is associated with chronic low-grade inflammatory response and activation of cell-mediated immunity, as well as activation of the compensatory anti-inflammatory reflex system. Yeah, so basically depression has been seen with inflammation. Inflammation is in the gut, is in the body, and is also in the brain, in the case of depression.
So in the case of depression, the brain is slightly inflamed, or certain parts of the brain are inflamed?
Same thing. It's not the whole brain, it's specific parts. Yeah, but it varies. Like that's the thing, is all this is kind of an overall, because honestly there's so much we still don't know. But yeah, parts of the brain are inflamed. The review explored the role of inflammation and oxidative and nitrosative stress as possible mediators of non-environmental risk factors in depression, and discusses potential implications of these findings. A range of factors appears to increase the risk for the development of depression and seems to be associated with systemic inflammation. This includes psychosocial stressors, poor diet, physical inactivity, obesity, smoking, altered gut permeability, atopy, dental care, sleep, and vitamin D deficiency. So first of all, first thing we have to establish on this is like there is two types of depression. In that case, the somatic and the cognitive. What they're referring to here is not like your mom just died and you're in a hole for 6 months. That's going to be a cause for depression, right? But that's on the cognitive side. What seems to be triggering depression episodes is also a somatic aspect where the body is going into freeze mode. So the gut flora can lead to that, the visceral fat can lead to that, and it seems that inflammation is also a factor that go to that. Why does it matter? Why? Because in a case of inflammation, as you're going to see that, it seems to, it's not the only factor, but a main factor during inflammation is cytokines. Cytokines are something that is released by adipose tissue, especially visceral adipose tissue. So the adipose tissue, fat, by fat. And the fat, which is called adipose tissue, releases something called an adipokines, which is the cytokines. But what is very interesting is this is especially true for visceral fat. Visceral fat releases a lot of cytokines, and we're going to go see here that is responsible for inflammation. It's not the only thing, but it's a main thing for inflammation. So
very blunt. If you carry more fat, there is more release of that.
Yeah, of that inflammatory factor.
And automatically you're more inflamed, or
yeah,
no?
Exactly. Okay. Pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah, oversimplification.
Oversimplification.
Pretty much. And it seems that the fat in the stomach releases more cytokine than the other ones.
Really?
It's a specificity of the visceral fat.
Oh wow.
do that. Yeah.
Oh, you probably already said that, but now I understand.
It doesn't matter. Well, because they have the same questions anyway. It's well, adipose. You know, they have ways of saying stuff. It was like central adipose tissue or something like that. What they meant by that is stomach fat, but they call it central adipose something. Like it's just they have their own lingo. It's like CrossFitters with fucking I did Grace today and Fran and. So studies is the same shit. Everybody has their own language.
CrossFitters always.
It's a coincidence. So
Cheater.
Background, yeah, sure. Background: there is not an extensive body of data showing that depression is associated with both chronic low-grade inflammatory response, activation. So chronic low-grade inflammatory response is also a chronically low-grade sympathetic response, because that's what inflammation is. It's a sympathetic reaction. So there's different ways to get to that. You have the visceral fat producing cytokines, but also a low sympathetic response can also provoke inflammation. So you get it from both sides.
So if you're too much on the parasympathetic, you can get it also if you have too much on the sympathetic.
If you get into a continuous, that's why they're going to talk about stress, because stress is what? Stress is expenditure of energy. That's literally the definition of stress. So it doesn't mean anything really. But if you're in a continuous expenditure of energy, we're talking about a continuous low-grade sympathetic reaction. Yeah. That leads to inflammation. You know, when you cut like this, you get red. The reason you get red is because the whole system is making sure it's going to kill all the germs and stuff that could enter. So that first like redness is necessary for you to heal. So whenever you have, or you know, like you tweak something, you get a massive like water retention, and the whole thing starts to swell. That's actually something that is created so that the healing can take place. So the healing is in the parasympathetic side, but in order to get the healing going, you first have an inflammation. So inflammation is part of the healing process. But too much of a good thing turns into a bad thing. So when you have an inflammation that is there, but that is, you know, that happens because it's a tweak and prepare, healing is fine. When inflammation stays and stays and stays and stays and stays, it doesn't go away, then you start destroying the body because it's taking over the healing process, because you never go toward the parasympathetic, which what we saw with the pandemic, for example. It's like it's an inflammatory disease. And so the sympathetic reaction just never stops. And that's what kills you. So what we see with those things, so a low-grade stress response continuously on the sympathetic will provoke an inflammation that just doesn't stop. So the problem is not the inflammation. The problem is that it doesn't stop. That's the problem with stress. The problem is not stress itself. You're supposed to have it. The problem is that it doesn't stop. You never get a break. That's when it gets you. You know what I mean? Everything is a balance. Everything is an arch. So depression is an acute illness, right? The leading cause of disability worldwide, but higher levels of inflammation appear to increase the risk for the development of de novo depression. So that means that the high inflammation response shows that once you have depression, you're more likely to get it again. So to bounce down, not bounce back, but bounce down into depression if you keep an inflamed state. So that's going to matter because, for example, it would mean that you could start a depression on the cognitive side, your mom died, and then because of a low-grade inflammation of stress, maybe excess visceral fat or stuff like that, it would keep the thing going and lead you into a deep hole where you just could not get out of. And you would see a major depression disorder. So we have to understand that in that case, inflammation is one of the leading roles of depression. It is not the only one, but it's going to be one of the leading roles.
That's a bit off topic, but it would also show you even more of the danger of a lot of kids that now have more depressive things.
Right.
Signs early on, because if you have it early on, it means that you're more likely to get it again and again and again.
Yeah, and again on top of it. And if you were to abuse certain food that creates inflammation, and we know that of sodas and, you know, with the chemicals and all that stuff, then you would increase the risk of staying depressed your entire life, for example, in that case. But that's what it means de novo. It's just, you know, continuous state of depression. Depression is not a disease, it's a freeze mode. You have a physical freeze mode and a mental freeze mode. Well, inflammation over, you know, staying inflamed causes a freeze mode because the body just can't stay continuously in an expenditure of energy, so it just cranks the body Because the body's like, I don't know what's happening, so I'm going to stop everything, which makes sense. Except you're introducing that inflammation through different means. For example, outside stress, food, things like that, lack of activity. So it's an overall, right? But inflammation is a very important factor in that somatic depression. It keeps you in that state and it ravages the body over time. So, and for example, cytokines induce depressive-like behaviors. In studies where healthy participants are given endotoxin infusions of trigger cytokines release, so that means that they're just triggering the release of cytokines in the body, classical depressive symptoms emerge. Exogenous, from the outside, cytokines infusions also cause the classical phenotypic behavioral and cognitive features of depression. So that means that the cytokines infusion, so they were given that depression symptoms physically, but also cognitive, which means it wasn't just shutting down the body, it was shutting down the minds as well. So the inflammation, when it reaches the brain, knocks you down on the cognitive side as well. So it's a bitch, basically. Intriguingly, antidepressants, particularly selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that's the SSRIs, the typical antidepressants that people take, in vitro or ex vivo, so exert significant negative immunoregulatory effects, decreasing the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines. Right, so what they're saying is that the SSRIs, which is your typical antidepressant, affect something relating to serotonin, which is why we think it's working. But they happen to also counteract the effect of the cytokines. So it is possible the SSRIs are working not just because of their effect on serotonin, but also because they lower the inflammation, the role of the cytokine in inflammation.
So they lower the inflammation. That's also why it works. Is that what you're saying? Or no?
Well, that's what it seems to be. We don't know for sure, but it's an interesting coincidence that the antidepressant also lower the role of the cytokines. Because again, you take healthy participants that are fine, you give them cytokines, they get depressed. They have the exact same symptoms of depressed people. You lower the action of the cytokines, people are less depressed. That's interesting. So again, causation versus correlation, it's always complicated, but at least there's correlation, yeah. There's something there. And again, what is very interesting with cytokines is visceral fat is a major responsible for producing that. So all roads lead to Rome type of thing, you know what I mean? So clinical depression is accompanied by a resistance to these ex vivo and vitro effects of antidepressants attenuating inflammation. Remission of clinical depression is accompanied by normalization of inflammatory markers, which means when people get off depression, we see the inflammatory being lower. So there's a correlation between inflammation and depression symptoms. This resistance to the immunosuppressive effects of antidepressants in depressed patients may be explained by chronic inflammation processes, chronic damage and the onset of autoimmune responses. So again, what I find fascinating about that is they're talking about the cognitive aspect of depression and the lowering of the inflammation. Lowering of inflammation means that your immune system is calming down.
It has to work less hard.
Is working less hard.
Because it's not trying to fight that inflammation.
Right, but it's also the immune system that causes the inflammation with the cytokines and everything. It's not fighting the inflammation, the immune system is the inflammation.
Okay.
Yeah, and cytokines are part of that. So what is interesting is as you reduce the inflammation, the immune system therefore is not working as hard, the emotional response, the negative emotional response starts to decrease. Which again, as we saw, there is a relationship between the immune system and the emotional system, so the cognitive part of the depression. So it seems that all this is associated with the immune system, and the cytokines are provoking a response from the immune system in the sense of inflammation, which is how the immune system fights almost everything at first. Of all the factors in this review, stressors and trauma have attracted the greatest extent literature. We want depression to be mostly a psychosocial stressor. it doesn't seem to be true. It's part of it, obviously, but it's not the only thing. Like acute psychological trauma or PTSD and things like that. So psychological stressors such as negative life events and chronic psychological stress often precedes the onset of clinical depression, which is true, but that's going to precede the onset of depression on the cognitive side, not on the somatic side. So the key of all this is to understand that, of course, there are traumatic events that will drop you in depression from the cognitive side, but there are other traumatic events that are metabolic insults that can do the exact same thing from the body side. So you can get to depression from both sides, either from a mental stressor or from a physical stressor.
Yeah. So those metabolic insults are, for example, visceral fat, right?
Visceral fat will cause metabolic insults, like prediabetes, inflammation, all that stuff. So imagine your mom dying, causing you to depression. We understand that. The point is that that sugar that you're eating over time is the equivalent of your mom dying from a body perspective, because it will cause the same shutdown mechanism as the other side, just from the other side of the equation. Evidence from animal models have long suggested that early exposure to trauma in childhood may increase the subsequent risk of poor functioning of the immune, endocrine, and nervous system.
So basically, if you have a traumatic event early on, you're more likely to have a weak spot in that immune system, which is you're more likely to...
Right, and that's where the emotion immune system are the same start to get very interesting. It's like it seems that if you
there's
have...
a damage in the
from the emotional system, and that seems to damage the immune system response. Damage in the sense of it can, for example, provoke, because when you have early trauma, you have early sympathetic reaction, fight, flight, all that stuff, freeze. It creates the same hole within the immune system. It creates an increased inflammation that seems to lead to increased depression.
So maybe it's a very oversimplified question, but is it then also possible that when you have an early childhood trauma that it leads to, for example, more of a craving towards sugar?
It could, technically it could. The second you're within those sympathetic response, it will make you crave carbs more, because the sympathetic wants to be fed. Yeah, it would. It would. So, yeah, and after that there's other psychological
effects.
Very
oversimplified.
No, well, yes and no, because if you look, you have that a lot, like women that were raped at a very early age, end up being overweight, and the idea was always, part of the idea was like they don't want to be attractive anymore, because that's what got them raped in the first place, for example. That would be that, also with the idea of being addicted to the sympathetic side, anger issues, stuff like that. So that's the problem, is it's never one thing. It's always a collection of things. But again, that relationship, immune system, emotion is the key to, one of the keys to all this, right? Fundamental idea that stress occurring early in life can exert persistent effects over long periods of time, not only increasing susceptibility to somatic and psychiatric illnesses, but potentially interfering with treatment response. Yep. Right. The association between childhood adversity and vulnerability to inflammatory disease cannot be fully explained by a prolonged period of stress initiated by such an event. What they're saying is that vulnerability to inflammatory disease cannot be explained just by the psychological trauma associated with the event. I mean, rather, it is possible that learned maladaptive responses to stress occurring in early childhood because of the trauma are employed later in adult life in response to stressors. So that you learn a fucked up response to stress as a kid, and then you do that as an adult. And because emotion and immune response system are the same, your inability to deal with certain emotion as a kid that lead to your inability to deal with it as an adult create the same thing as an immune response. So you've learned to create a immune response incorrect in early childhood that will lead all the way to your adult life.
But does that make a direct link between behavior and health then?
Yep, that's basically what it is. It's exactly that, and vice versa. But it's a two-way street. I mean, that's why early trauma seems to be. So it tells you that stress is not just physiological. There's no such thing as physiological and psychological. They are the same thing. Yeah. We put them in boxes, so that's what I call functional segregation. Is we put them in boxes to study them. The body doesn't care. Emotions and physiological and psychological are the same thing. but it's a two-way street. We want psychological to lead to physiological. That is not true. Sometimes it's a physiological that leads to psychological. Your thoughts are not always yours. They are yours, but they're not yours in the conscious sense of most people in the Western world have that idea that we control our own thoughts. That's something you hear all the time. No, stop separating your thoughts from your body. It doesn't work like that. Your thoughts are an accumulation of all the experiences of your body. Part of that experience being free will, being that conscious processing of information. But not all of it is that. You have lower hierarchies in your body that are happening far outside your conscious realm. And they are part of you just as much as the rest. We want to put the unconscious over there and the conscious mind as the leading director of the body. That is mistaken. There are influences on your conscious minds you do not understand by definition. They're still part of you though. That's why your environment is very important. That's why your food will dictate who you become over time. And that's even without the gut flora.
Yeah.
So that idea with a conscious thought is it's a mistake. It's very, very complex. Like the human body is, like the body versus the mind. This is very, very much a Western way of thinking. It's very, very dangerous because ego gets in the way, and then we think like my own thoughts are separated from things such as food or stuff like that, and that's not true. And it hits you on the level through hierarchies that you have no control over. It's like you don't control how fast your heart goes. Not on a regular basis, you don't.
Yeah, but if you get in that mindset, you automatically separate your parts of yourself.
Mm-hmm. It's functional segregation, which is very useful at the beginning when you want to study something. You always need functional segregation. Like it's like physics, right? You have to put it in pieces and then you put it back at the end. Functional integration. The problem is people get stuck with functional segregation. They put things in boxes and they think they understand. You don't. Just because you split things to understand them better doesn't mean you don't get to put them back at the end. Problem is when you put everything back, suddenly instead of having A equals B, you have fucking like a result that comes from 16 different places. And it brings the complexity of the whole thing to levels that make it very hard to understand. And that's where human ego gets in, is no, you won't understand. You won't, it's too complex. It's 4D chess. The world does not owe you an explanation. We're just trying to understand how some of the stuff works, but you have to understand the whole thing is far too complex. So all we're trying to do is to see where the influences are and to see if we can limit them. That we can do. But the first thing you need to do is to understand that.
To understand that you don't understand, basically.
Right, first of all, and that your thoughts are not your thoughts in that sense. It's like you think they are, but so you think everything is like I feel bad, therefore I am bad, which is unfortunately what you see in depression. Is that inability to get out of the hole makes you feel like you're failing. In that case, it's not true. Your body is failing. In most cases, your body is failing because you're feeding it shit. So sometimes it's that simple. Stop feeding your body shit, and then you won't feel like shit. It sounds overly simple, but that's one of those things. And dealing with stress and being physically active so that you learn to deal with stress. And by the way, there's that aspect too. Training is not just to sweat. Training is to teach you to deal with stress. It's going to get your confidence. It's going to teach you discipline. It's going to teach you to get better at things. You know what I mean? Life is not that simple. Life is not that simple. That whole shit is complicated, man. And it's just the way it is. So, for example, there is evidence that personality and the way in which an individual responds to psychological stressors, such as examination of stress or job strain, may contribute to inflammatory processes.
Right.
Exactly
so
what I
the
meant.
way you deal with the world is basically tells you how much of an inflammation you carry?
Yeah, and vice versa. So it means that the inflammation process and emotions are the same thing. Inflammation is just a physical representation of your emotional state. Or is it that your emotions are just a mental representation of your immune system? Right. So in Western society, if we start to say emotions are just a representation of your immune system, like that would not be very flattering now, is it? You know what I mean? That's part of the problem. Then now we're starting to chop at the idea of the soul right now. And that's why I think a lot of people have problem is the more we get into that, like, but then who I am? Am I just a is my idea of me a idealized representation of actually how the world affects my system? Yeah. That doesn't change who you are, though. That doesn't change the beauty of the human experimentation. That doesn't change the joy that you feel with your loved ones.
But that's also
Doesn't change anything.
What you do or the experiences you have in your life make you.
Your connection to the world matters. That's what it means. Yes, like people think they are those islands of pure light within a world of this, and it's a mistaken idea. But that's we are attacking the foundation of the not the Christian faith, but of a lot of principles that were laid by the Christian faith in the Western society. But that idea of the soul being separated from the body is absurd. Right? So that way, I don't think it creates tough questions. I just think it challenges the ego toward what you means. That's all. I don't think it changes the human experience at all. People still do great things and horrible things. You still find great joy in your loved ones. It doesn't change any of that. That's a reality as well. It's just the root cause of who we are might be more linked in the body than we understand. That's all, I feel. Responses to social stress via neural activity lead to marked increase in inflammatory activity. So same thing, back to it. On diet, there have been substantial changes to dietary habits globally over recent decades. No shit. Wherein dietary patterns high in fiber, nutrient-dense foods, and omega-3 fatty acids have been replaced by diets higher in saturated fats and refined sugar.
So we started to eat less healthy.
Yeah. Whether diet quality contributes to psychopathology, particularly the common mental disorder, depression, anxiety, has been a focus of much recent research. Yep. Blah, 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 blah. Read the paper because the stuff goes on and on and on and on. And then he goes into exercise. It's a good paper. It's a very good paper. Gut permeability, the microbiome, like we talked about last time, it goes into that as well. Dental care, that'd be funny when after the tooth story, would be a good one because sleep is in there, dental care is in there.
We're just going to skip dental care
vitamin
completely.
D. Let's not talk about teeth. Inflammation and immune activation across major psychiatric disorder. There's also evidence that in many other major psychiatric disorders are accompanied by activation of inflammatory and cell-mediated immune pathways. For example, mania, being manic, like super obsessive over certain things. You know that one? Schizophrenia, PTSD, the first paper showing inflammation, increased level of cytokines. In acute and euthymic manic patients were published in the 90s. A recent meta-analysis confirmed that mania and bipolar disorder are accompanied by activation of inflammatory...
I'm not laughing at this, I'm laughing at the way he sees it.
Yes, because he might be hitting home for whatever reason. So, accompanied by activation of inflammatory cell-mediated negative immunoregulatory cytokines. Based on the first results obtained in schizophrenia, Sins and Myers launched the T-cell theory of schizophrenia. Yeah. Anyway.
So what, translating this real quick?
Same shit. That a lot of what they call mental diseases might have at least one of their roots in an immunoresponse, which is why that paper on affective immunology is so important. It seems that the mental processes, your emotional response to the outside world, has a correlation to your immune system response to the outside world. It seems to be the same. That inflammation.
That also says that then all those mental diseases are just a way of reacting to the world. Is
one of the basis of those, yes. One of the basis of those. Not the basis, but yeah. Mm-hmm. That has a foundation in that. Like that manic thing is just the immune system response. So that certain things could drive you toward being more manic, not you, just in general, more manic or more things like that. That it would just be an inflammation to something that just makes you emotionally more prone to respond a certain way. And early trauma would have taught that, which in your case would make sense, right?
So, for example, people with like schizophrenia or stuff like that, is it always then linked to?
No, but that's okay. So now we're going into deeper rabbit holes. You have to understand, schizophrenia, there's positive and negative symptoms, right? You have the positive symptoms, which is like George V is telling you to go hunt dragons with a sword. You're laughing, but it happens.
No, I'm not laughing.
Yeah, it's happened. Maybe it wasn't George V, but they were instructed to go hunt dragons.
Specific.
Yeah, because they always are. It's a very specific vision that they have that tell them to do very specific things. And the negative symptoms is catatonia. You see that a lot, but those are just very high positive or very high negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And so what you see very high level of emotion, you see no level of emotion. Same shit, you see high level inflammation in both cases. You just see drives to different things. Mm-hmm. Which is same thing as bipolar, just extra. Right, or a manic, depressive type of behavior.
Yeah.
So it could be, but that could be learned early on through trauma. Let's say 7 or 8. I mean, you will learn to have a certain trauma. You will learn to react a certain way, and that creates a manic behavior that can last into childhood, into adulthood, very strongly. So summary, in interpreting this data, a number of factors need to be borne in mind. First, depression is a very pleomorphic and heterogeneous phenotype, and there are likely to be substantial differences in results depending on whether studies examine clinical or non-clinical samples. So basically, depression has many different root causes, as we saw, and it's a complicated subject. The identification of a number of potential factors that are known sources of inflammation and their correlation to quality evidence linking those factors to increased risks of depression provides mechanistic support for inflammation as one of the mediating pathways to both risk and neuroprogression in depression. The pivotal element is that most of these are plastic and amendable to intervention, both therapeutic and preventative. While inflammation has suggested a number of very promising anti-inflammatory therapies, including statins, aspirin, etc., pills, the latter preventative need is perhaps the most pressing. Psychiatry largely lacks an integrated model for conceptualizing modifiable risk factors for depression. It has therefore lacked conceptually and pragmatically coherent primary prevention strategies prioritizing the treatment of established disorders.
So what they're saying
is actually dissing psychiatry.
So what they're saying is basically we have been getting
well, they
more
say,
and
yeah,
more
the
pills,
rational targets imperative to focus on prevention of depression at a population level is clear. They're dissing psychiatry. They're saying like we are so focused on dealing with symptoms, we are not understanding that depression is a complex level that is best treated as a preemptive factor because inflammation can be triggered by so many different things that it's an overall preventive mechanism that will work against depression, not the psychiatry approach of treating symptoms. It's a diss on psychiatry. Like,
yeah, the way
I
they
love that
phrase
conclusion.
It is literally like
it's a diss. So what they're saying is if we focus on, because the problem on focusing on symptoms is that you don't treat
the cause.
Well, you don't treat the inflammation system. Yeah. You will reduce it by reducing for example, the emotional response. But even if you use SSRIs, you limit the inflammation. But over time, you're always going to lose that battle because if you have the same food, the same lack of exercise, it's always going to lead to greater inflammation, which seems to be a great factor in depression. Just like, for example, the pre-diabetes. Now you see, like the insulin resistance, that's the immune system response as well. So it seems that depression and the immune system response are linked. So that would explain why we saw that the visceral fact has such an impact on depression. And again, emotions and the immune system are related, to say the least, if they're not the same thing, if they're not just different representation of the same principle. So you cannot go around, that's what their conclusion is, trying to treat symptoms because you will always lose. It will always come back. If there's an inflammatory action within the body, depression will win. That's what they're saying, because depression is a freeze mode. And as we see, it can be lack of exercise. It can be like the dental problems. I would explain why I was in a semi-state of depression the entire time. Is because this was an inflammation that was killing me slowly and therefore putting me in a depressive state, as I was talking about. So you would have a lack of exercise, you would have teeth issues, you would have diet, you would have inflammation response, so visceral fat. And then he goes like this, read the paper, there's a list of things that can create inflammation. And all of them, as we've seen, has been linked to depression. So and on top of obviously stress at work and your mom dying. But there are many reasons that increase the rate of depression. That is, again, the number one disability worldwide. So make no mistake, the increase of obesity in the world as we see it in the Western world and the increase of depression are linked. And it doesn't mean that obese is bad, but it means that health-wise, obese is bad. And it means that bad health means depression. It's a freeze mode, which I've been saying all along. So anyway, I wanted to cover the relationship between visceral fat, again producing cytokines, visceral fat and depression in a part 1, 2, 3, and 4, so that we can move the debate in that direction in the next podcast. Not the next one. We'll do a series on something else, but as we go, obviously, we're going to go back always to the same.
We'll come back in a month or something. So
yeah, we'll periodically, because there's so many studies, so much stuff. I might do another podcast on the affective immunology, since you didn't see that one. I think I should do another one. It's always good to have new clarifications, right? For example, I'll redo all the podcasts so that way you know what I'm talking about. That's one way to do it, right? Exactly. That's just
Such
being.
A bird.
That's.
No
I disagree with no reason.
Are you inflamed somewhere or something?
Huh?
Is this your response?
That totally is my response. Because you were trying to get me, and I'm getting you back. Except I'm doing it during the podcast because it's my podcast. Anyway, we will see you guys next week with Janina and Moppy. Right? So guys.
Bye.